Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the closing session of day one. We are approximately 8 hours-ish into the breach that we have been studying at Northern Horizons Power Generation, and there have been lots of takeaways from today, and I'd like to use the next 30 minutes or so to summarize some of those action items, which you will see reflected in the playbooks that will be provided at the end of this exercise, rather at the end of day three. I mentioned this at the opening, that preparedness is not a luxury, it is a necessity. And one of the things that we realized today is that you really cannot wait for an incident like this to happen to realize your vulnerabilities. I'll be going around the table with, once again, leaders from across North America, across Canada, from different public sector environments, private sector environments, independent folks as well, with lots of experience amongst them, to determine what are some of those action items based on the three-ish modules that we covered throughout the day. Once again, my name is Ali, and I've been your host for today, and I'm looking forward to taking you through some of these key takeaways. Mark, you've had the pleasure of being my co-host for today, and you will be with me for the next few days as well. I'll start off with you, but then I'll go to Kelly as well. Mark, from your perspective, I come to you first primarily because of your own seat in a utility energy sector providing environment. What was one of the major things that struck you today as we went through this breach?
Well, I think what it struck me was that this is the scenario we're dealing with right now, historically, is unlikely. Having more than 1 million customers out for 8 hours is not something I've seen more than once in my life. 2003 blackout was, I think, the only time that's happened in the past several decades. But there is, with the increasing addition of technology and two-way power generation from customers to utility and utility to customers, which is being introduced right now through pilot programs, there's a pretty big likelihood that it could happen again, but for a very different reason.
Okay. I just want to take that a little bit, and I'm not contradicting what you've said, but Kelly, I'll bring you into this conversation. You know, when COVID hit, a lot of us sort of reactively asked how many organizations had pandemic preparedness plans. And the likelihood of something of this nature was really not on all of our radars. Do you agree with what Mark has said, that something like this may not be likely, but if it does happen, it could have catastrophic effects?
Yeah, I do. And I think the risk and then the impact are two different things. So the risk may be low, but the impact will be high. And through the day, what really struck me was in the planning that companies do, the utilities do, the companies that depend on those utilities, we have a lot of assumptions around what will be available, and we may not be testing those assumptions strongly enough. So we assume that we'll be able to communicate to our customers, we assume we'll be able to communicate to our employees. If we can't do that, what's the next step? Have we created a plan B if communications become, if not impossible, more difficult? So we do rely on our electrical services, we do rely on our internet, we do rely on our telecom in order to rally people and bring them together. And if we're unable to do that, what's the next step? And I don't think there's enough planning around that.
Okay. Greg, just bring you into the conversation before we go module by module and break it down. From your perspective, looking at things from a healthcare standpoint, as well as emergency services, same question as with Mark, what was one thing that really stood out to you?
I would say more than anything, the need for collaboration. It happens when events like this come into play. It happens, after large events and sometimes during, but not enough during, and not enough in general, right? Right now, the attackers are working so closely together that you may have 4 different attack groups involved in the chain to get to something like this, probably even more for a big scale event like this. And in the security space, we need to practice that same collaboration. Vendors, organizations, security teams, we need to work as one unit. And the more we can prepare together, the more we can test together like this, the better off we'll be during, I would say.
Kush?
look at healthcare, we always look at hospitals or medical facilities and them being up and running to take care of the patients. But what I think we forget and we need to keep as the lesson learned is the healthcare and the well-being of the actual defenders, the incident response folks, the staff, right, the external contractors, and the first responders. But more importantly, we have to keep the health of the citizenship in mind always. And that means not only thinking about the physical locations of where we have ill folks, but also the folks that are just normal everyday folks that we need to make sure and concentrate on them. And then the folks that are, the people that are actually trying to remediate the situation are generally forgotten. So we have to make sure during that time of crisis that we are not we're not looking at them and saying, hey, put in your expense reports. Why are you buying that extra pizza for? Like, those are the kind of things that actually happen, and it's frustrating because they're trying to focus on the task at hand, and all these logistical and other administrative processes, people still follow them, right, in those remarkable circumstances. And I think, for me, and I think we should take the lesson learned is people have to be the focus, and we have to keep that mindset. And if we don't, we're going to burn the few people that we have that are actually the ones that are smart enough to help with the situation.
Okay. Very important notes, Kush. Just in the interest of time, I want to go module by module. Some general comments have worked very well for us. Let's start off with Module 1. And Ali Shahidi, if I can bring you into this conversation. Module 1 focused on breach identification and the initial response. One of the things we found ourselves, and I'm going to use this word politely, fixated with was, and especially this comes from the CIS control, is an asset inventory and a network topology, etc. It became apparent to us that while this information might exist, it exists in bits and pieces. What is a key takeaway that you take from this in terms of how you put together what you know about your network and how you make it accessible during times of emergency?
Well, this is the key, actually, factor for any type of incident response. Very same, the very first step, that we need to know what we have in place, what we don't have in place. And this is a traditional and classical type of issue that asset management has been always lacking across the board, and especially depending on the age of the organizations and entities. And even from the vulnerability perspective, that's been always the factor and the case. But the reality is that if we don't have a clear idea of our network, what we have and what we don't have, and if we are still dealing with the network diagrams that belong to 10 years ago, and we have changed and we have moved even completely out of that data center, maybe cloud service provider, then we don't know how to respond to that. And this has been, again, goes back to the telemetry and the visibility into the environment. And you need that. If you don't, then you're basically witch hunting, and you're trying to just come up with assumptions that are going to make the situation worse.
Okay. Working with assumptions. Now, we did have quite a lot, and Mirza and Amar, if I can bring you, Amar, I'll start with you. We did have some information as to what exists, the network topology, etc. But one of the things that we were also struggling with at that point was who can we reach out to at this point, given that there is a power outage. And we saw some challenges over there in terms of who gets involved, how quickly you can get responses, etc. And then also involvement of third parties and MSPs, etc. What would you say would be one of your key takeaways from a communication standpoint around how we started going through the effects of the breach?
So it's something that we've talked about a lot today, and that's the pre-planning, right? If you can pre-plan all of that in advance, your communications, and I understand, there's certain things, a certain situation, you're going to have to pivot and make some changes. But again, I think I mentioned this earlier, when you have situations like that, you don't want to have to go, what am I going to do? You want to be able to react and go, I know, here's my plan, here's the layout, here's what I'm going to say right now, because I need to give a message, I need to say something, maybe not going to be a lot, but it's something, right? And as far as getting a hold of other people and who you have, again, it's all about pre-planning. Make sure that today you are reaching out and saying, you know, whether it's a retainer for a law firm or a retainer for forensics, you are reaching out and you are already putting those pieces in place so that when the event happens, it's, hey, we're ready. Get these people in. We know who these people are. We're not going to pick up the yellow pages and try to find somebody. We've already got everything in place, and we're going to act. And that's the biggest thing. The faster that you can act, the faster that you'll be able to kind of protect yourself.
Keeping up with this comment on fast and pace, Mirza, I'll bring you into this. As we were looking at the situation, we culminated Module 1 by saying we're not yet sure if this is a cyber incident or a breach, those are two different elements, but we weren't quite ready to openly say, yes, this is a breach. Yes, this is a cyber incident. There's traces of it, there's signs of it, but nothing more than that. From your perspective, for an organization to declare, yes, we've experienced a cyber incident, what are some critical action items that you would draw from what you've experienced this today?
So first of all, we should have a BCP. Like I think everybody address about the BCP. The formal BCP should be exercised at least once a year. Everybody should know their responsibility. And like one of the requirement is, okay, we have the documentation on SharePoint or Confluence or somewhere. What happens if the electricity is not there? What if the internet is not there? How do you get it? So we have some printed documents. We have a BCP plan, like what happens if we are not able to come to the office. So some of the BCP plans, for example, like I will give you one best example. I live near the nuclear plant. And I get the information every year. I get the pill like every 2 or 3 years. What to do in case of any leakage. So it's a highest risk, high impact, and I'm still living there, and because I'm comfortable, I know what to do in case of leakage. So the thing is, we need a formal documentation, communication. That's the action plan, but one of the hardest thing in the whole day that we are talking about, we are trying to address. We communicated several times, we addressed several times, but still it is not easy. And the thing is to get out from the status quo, breaking the silos, and communicating together. This is the biggest thing. It's easy to say, hard to implement. But I think it's not too late, it's not impossible, we can do it if we know.
Absolutely, there are multiple players that are involved. And one of the things, and Julie, I'll bring you into this conversation, one of the things that you and I discussed in your takeaways from Module 1 was you began to realize very quickly how the IT environment and the OT environment are separated, significantly. Almost looks like the OT environment's a completely different team. With the work that you do and the awareness campaigns that you run leading into Module 2, are there any takeaways or anything that you might do different from a public awareness perspective based on what you saw today?
Yes, certainly. I think that's a great question there, Ali. In terms of the work that we do here, and then the establishment of the Center of Excellence is just doing that, right? I think some common things I'm hearing here is, raising education and awareness for all stakeholders involved so that we could be prepared for critical incidents such as what we've witnessed today, but also encouraging cross-sector collaborations that we're seeing for information sharing. And that's one of the emphasis here at the Center of Excellence, and some of the campaigns that we roll out on cybersecurity.ca is just that, is raising that education and awareness out for the people. In terms of the different departments between IT and OT, there should be some separations as we saw from Modules 1 moving into Module 2. But I think the last key takeaway was the continuous improvement that we're seeing through regular reviews, updates, and lessons learned from these exercises and real incidents can really strengthen overall preparedness. And just to really echo what Mohammed had shared this morning, really make it a muscle memory, right? So making sure that we're doing these drills and practices ahead of time, and we're facilitating these tabletop exercises for ministries across the Ontario government. One key area that we see as a key lessons learned is how do you tighten up your response plans, tighten up your communications, and make sure that there's a clear response plan and making sure you're clarifying your response plans.
If I can just work with that a little bit, Mark, I want to come to you because you brought this up when you were discussing in the last session is, we were talking about telecommunications, and I know I don't want to dive deep into Module 3B right now, but just very quickly from your side, Julia mentioned these exercises, Mirza mentioned that there has to be proactive communication and you have to assume these things can happen and consistently get the message out there. He even mentioned, in your utilities bill, there should be some sort of messaging there. From your perspective, the role of mandating some of these actions. Right now, these are either there's yourself attesting to follow certain standards. Do you take any takeaways here from around how we can mandate utilities to do some of these activities to ensure that they're actually done and done to standard, as opposed to just saying, we've issued out a message and that's enough? Is there any role, let's say for the CRTC perhaps, or any other body to mandate these BCP plans and disaster management plans?
Yeah, there is. The legislation's already in place. The Ontario Energy Board, which regulates the utilities across Ontario, has a cybersecurity framework which is mainly based on NIST 800, I think, and it mandates the requirement for hundreds of controls. I think it's 108 controls, and having a BCP is one. Actually practicing the effort of it and doing simulations, doing red blue team, that kind of stuff, that's in there right now. It is only recently that there's been some movement on enforcement. It came out in 2017, but until this year, there hasn't been a sort of, you're going to do these this year, which is actually just happened, and it's October that we're mandated to meet some of them.
Yeah. Point. Greg, if I can turn to you and sticking with the same things, thank you, Julia and Mark, for that. Greg, we talked about public awareness, crisis communications. You also started to look at the different layers of communications, communicating with doctors, communicating with nurses, with pharmacies, etc. What stood out for you as a takeaway that people need to pay attention to in terms of should we find ourselves in this situation?
I'd say different stakeholders and what they need to know, all the way from the public to people, in the healthcare example, sure, running the hospital, the doctors, things like that. Like the pandemic showed us that everyone has a role to play. And everyone needs information to be able to do their job in order to perform that role collectively and in step with each other, right? So I think that communication piece is key, and you framed it as well. There's different layers, there's different stakeholders, right? So you have to think of what does the public need to know, what do the executives need to know, and just each and every stakeholder that has a role to play, what do they need to know and how can I communicate with them? Another theme that came up, which is important as well, is singular and unified messaging. We see it with breaches all the time where there's broken telephone and things are getting twisted. The more of that happens, which it'll always happen in these scenarios, the more of a disservice it is, right? So the more that people can use and stick to singular messaging targeted to different stakeholders, the stronger off everyone is and the smoother it will go.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So that sort of covers some of the items from Module 1 and Module 2, and we have about 9 minutes left. Amit, if I can lean on your expertise on this. We looked at emergency services and healthcare together, and one of the comments that was made, I think it was by Martin, was around equity of service. Rural areas, urban areas, and how the response plans might change depending on where you're located geographically. Any takeaways that you would like to highlight from that discussion?
I think the takeaways are still the same. Unified communication, having a framework in place. Certainly, those frameworks would shift a little bit in their focus when it comes to rural areas or some suburban areas. I think the key here is, as long as you perform your cybersecurity drills, you perform your disaster recovery planning, you have a good BCP in place, which is revisited every few months or whatever that duration is, and as long as you are perfecting it, it's rather than assuming that it's a perfect BCP in place. There is never a perfect BCP in place. As long as it's a work in progress, I think that's what matters. So I would not say it's limited to urban or rural areas. What I'm saying is, overall, I think it's the same approach. We just need to look at it more cautiously, and we need to not take things for granted. That's all I can say.
Speaking of taking things for granted, Rachel, one thing that you brought up a lot during our session when we were looking at telecoms was don't necessarily take it for granted that this is just an attack that's happening and it will be done. We have to look at threat intelligence. And tomorrow, we plan to dive a little bit deeper into threat intelligence. But from your perspective, you brought up that point 3 times. We need to understand what this attacker is doing. From what you heard, was there anything in particular that you found was missing in our action items that we need to incorporate when it comes to dealing with threat intelligence?
Yeah, so I think it's, know who it is you're potentially dealing with. So, of course, you're never going to know with 100% certainty who's doing this to, your country or your business. But they're giving you clues along the way, right? And it's piecing those clues together to try to understand what is the worst version of this that could unfold, and how prepared are we to deal with that reality? So Kelly, for example, brought up this point of, it's great that we have backup plans, but what about when your backup plan needs a backup plan, right? So how are we testing that plan? And when things like misinformation get in the way, when we have these large-scale attacks and victims are being confronted with, false narratives or different things, how are we taking into account who the threat actor might be and all of the different contingencies that come along with that?
On point. Kush, if I can loop you in, you had a lot to say at the opening when it came to the national economic impact. That impact is obviously increasing, that value is increasing as we go along. From your perspective, why at this point, given that this breach is still ongoing and this incident is still ongoing, where do you see rather that national economic impact headed to, and what will that tell us about our level of preparedness?
I think there's a correlation, and this is not kind of written in fact, but this is based on experience and based on the correlation of financial instruments and the spending that has to occur to counter emergency, so whether it be COVID, whether it be cyber attack, versus the preparedness. So if you are more prepared as a country, the cost, in my opinion, would be lower. If you are less prepared, the cost will increase. Why? Because we don't have those communication channels, we don't have the integration set up, and we have to spend more to get that organized, to get external parties. So what'll happen is, if you're more organized, you could use internal resources a lot more. And you could do the coordination, and obviously internal resources are, cost less. External resources are probably going to be 3 to 5 times more per hour, for example. So there's a direct correlation to how prepared you are versus how much the output's going to be in terms of the spend to remediate the breach.
Thank you for that. Last couple of minutes, and then Kelly and Greg, feel free to chime in. Oh, Ali, go ahead, please.
I think one of the biggest challenges that we are facing is the fact that within each industry, let's say power utilities or telecom, there is no type of centralized shared services that would be able to basically work with all together, and they share the intel with each other. This has been always the case, and the challenge between any industry that we are talking about, that they don't want to share because of the legal privacy concerns and all of those factors, and they are holding back, so they are not helping each other to come up with that unified type of model, and at the same time pass the intel to each other that if it happened on this side, maybe we can help on the other side. And so that these factors, as a part of again being prepared, we need to have build that type of relationship among all of the players that are a part of the same industry.
Very quickly, Kelly, I'll go to you, and then Greg and Mark, a closing comment from you as well. Kelly, from your perspective, tomorrow we'll be looking at the impact on utilities and the impact on the financial markets. Could you comment a little bit about why these two areas, financial markets and utilities, are particularly important?
Yeah, through everything today, I'm struck with a cyber breach is not a tech event, it's a human event. And I think through all the conversations, the commonality is what's happening to the people. How are people impacted? They can't get home, they can't get to their kids, they can't do their jobs, they can't feel safe. And people want to feel safe financially, and utilities are something that they expect to work and count on every day, and we don't think about them until they're not there. So I think that if we just keep in mind that at the end of the day, a cyber breach or a cyber attack is about the impact to humans, we'll make the right decisions and we'll make the right priorities. I think there's been too much in the recent press around cyber attacks about how much data has been stolen or captured, and it makes it feel less than human. It makes it feel transactional, like 1 billion records, 500 million records, and that's not really the impact of a cyber attack. It's what's happened to the people.
Great. Would you second that and agree with it?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely second it, definitely agree with it. And I would also just say, we live in a golden age where we'll probably look back and be thankful that, ransomware and data theft is all that we encountered. But with the emergence of, cybersecurity attacks becoming warfare, and we see that with conflicts around the world, and, every country has enemies, we're going to see more advanced scale attacks like this happening, right? So the preparation for that and the evolution on our end to get ready for it, I think, is key.
Mark, closing comments to you. Tomorrow we'll be looking at the impact on financial and utilities, but specifically to the utilities world. Should this attack continue, or this incident rather, continue into day 2 and day 3, what do you think will be top of mind for you other utility service providers across Canada and, as we will see, the United States as well?
So anyone in that situation on day 2, day 3, one of the things in the back of your mind other than what you're working on is how could we have avoided this? What could we have done so that this wouldn't have happened? And one of the common themes I think we saw as we were going through our exercises is that a little bit of effort goes a long way up front, right? So not just the plan, but if you're trust and verify. So if you're going to say we are going to inventory, monitor, maintain, and test our assets, writing that down somewhere doesn't make it actually happen. We've got to put the work in and have some kind of measurable outcome. And that's not different for saying, oh, our OT's air gap. Well, is it really? Because I've actually never seen it. And then that's not different for your BCP. Oh, we've got one somewhere, but did you test it? And then when you go to test it, but it's for the first event you've ever had, it falls over. That's something that I kept seeing as a common thing. I know these things take extra time, but it's at least 10 times less than it will take when what you need doesn't work. And then I wanted to make one comment about the shared intel across utilities. That is something that is also required as part of that framework. So there's a project called Project Lighthouse that is similar to like a CCTX type of thing, and it works with CSE. And all utilities in Ontario are going to be sharing metadata about their traffic types and happenings so that it can be centralized, and then if something nasty happens to one, the others get a heads up. Hey, this thing's going around.
Thank you for that, Mark. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for day 1 of the inaugural Operation Defend the North. Not only did we learn a lot about how to deal with different action items and what action items to take and prioritize, we also got to understand what happens in real time when you're trying to assess the situation at hand. My colleague Kelly put it best, a cyber situation is not just a technical situation, it is a human situation. And we hope that day 1 helped you understand how to prepare today for situations that might be coming tomorrow or even sooner than that. Thank you all for joining us for day 1, and I look forward to being your host alongside other leaders in Canada and North America for day 2. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you for joining us again.